reflecting back on it, it just seems so unbelievable that it would happen to me, because I used to be such a skeptic of these things, and you know, I'm the kind of person that would have said, unless I see it, I'm not going to believe it. My name's John Joseph. I was riding up the road. It's a narrow, pretty backcountry road, pretty remote. It was a beautiful morning, a blue sky. I usually ride every morning, and in this particular morning, I happened to come around this part of the ride where you see the whole valley open up, and as I approached the valley, I glanced to look down into the valley. It's a beautiful view, so that's why I was looking out there, and here in front of my eyes, I know it sounds outrageous, but in front of my eyes was this object that was shiny, silvery, no sound, just hovering 50 to 100 feet off the ground, and it was there for at least 3 to 5 seconds, because I was reaching, I have a phone that has a camera on it, so I was reaching into the back pocket where I carried my phone, trying to keep my eyes on the object, and unfortunately fumbled and dropped my phone on the pavement. I had to take my eyes off it. I grabbed the phone, looked up, and the object was gone. And it just seems so unbelievable to me. I rode the rest of my ride thinking, gosh, did I see what I saw? Because it happens so unexpectedly. You're just, one minute you're riding your bike, the next minute you're seeing something that's from, to me, another world, but I can't really, you know, all I can say is I saw something big, silvery, and hovering with no sound that appeared instantly and disappeared instantly.
If indeed our planet was at one remote and distant time visited by other life forms, as the record seems to show, then what becomes clear is that by universal law, these far more superior beings have been restrained from using their vast powers and forbidden from intruding into the destiny of the human race. Yet deep in the recesses of the subconscious mind, there abides a flicker of the celestial reality. But as we awaken daily to the material world in which we find ourselves, we forget the night visions, and in the confusion of our predicament, we tune our ear to the wrong channel. And the scraps and pieces left in the wake of history that remain to be collected and ponder remain fragmented and disconnected from our ability to calculate and apply to human logic. But if we stop long enough to collect our thoughts, radiate, or as some say, meditate on the supernatural, we are provided with a clear picture of a gateway to the galaxy. Okay, well, this is Pyramid Street, and we're about, like I said earlier, about 5 kilometers from the Great Pyramid. Our driver's coming shortly to pick us up. No, we're okay, thanks. We got a guy coming. Thank you. No, thanks. They come, everybody wants to pick you up and give you a ride anywhere you want to go, and there's millions of taxis, and this traffic is unbelievable. They don't really use these lines in the street. They just go wherever they want to go. If you're a Westerner, you don't want to drive in Cairo. It takes a special kind of a driver. We have the best driver in all of Cairo picking us up. Farrahat, you'll be meeting him shortly. But anyway, this is one of the busier streets. It's not that bad today, actually. But, traffic in Cairo is like none other than I've ever been in. So we'll be going towards the Giza Plateau shortly, and we're going to do a lot of filming up there, and over by the Sphinx, and taking a horse ride, and a lot of good things. So glad you're with us. Well, these are the back streets of Cairo, not far from the Sphinx. And as you can see, it's quite picturesque. And we're heading up towards the pyramids on the Giza Plateau. And we'll have a lot of great things to see when we're up there. But this is just a typical back street in Cairo that you don't often get to see. But here we are. It really is a trip back through time. No doubt about it. The massive engineering challenges that confronted the designer of the Great Pyramid, and which then had to be mastered, are clearly not even close to being grasped nor understood by the millions of guests that visit Egypt each and every year. When most people come to the Giza Plateau to visit the Great Pyramid, their first thoughts gravitate to this question: how did they ever move 2,500,000 inner core blocks into such an amazing structure? And then they may discover that the core blocks were covered with 144,000 six-sided white limestone casing blocks hauled 15 kilometers downriver from the Tura limestone quarry. If they look to the apex of the Great Pyramid, they would notice that the capstone is gone and wonder why, perhaps even associated with the Great Seal on the back of the American dollar. If they spent any time at all researching the Great Pyramid, they would recollect that the Great Pyramid is positioned in such a way that each of its sides perfectly corresponds to the 4 cardinal points of the compass. And remember, it is the most perfect compass the world has ever known to this day. They may even remember that the Great Pyramid is located in the center of the world's landmass, and that its height, discovered by satellite technology in the last century, is exactly congruent with the mean altitude of the Earth's landmass. Even the casual observer can't help from being drawn deeper and deeper with intrigue and fascination into the numerous and incomprehensible features of the Great Pyramid that defy human logic. Consider again the fact that in the last 80 years, it was discovered that the Great Pyramid was actually an 8-sided pyramid, the only one of its kind in all of Egypt. When the base was more carefully studied, it was discovered that the base of each side of the pyramid was actually curved at the same ratio as the circumference of the Earth. What enormous, incomprehensible engineering difficulties did this create for the designer in building this feature into the Great Pyramid? While these details are often taken with just a grain of salt, as are many of the other details simply glossed over, such as the 80-ton ceiling joists that formed the ceiling of the King's Chamber, which were shipped north 500 miles from Upper Egypt, all orientation to the time element in order to accomplish these seemingly impossible feats is lost. With the mind swamped and overshadowed with details defying human logic, it is not hard to bypass perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the construction of the only remaining wonder of the world. The foundation of the Great Pyramid not only had to be on a solid platform of hard granite in order to support the 5,200,000 tons of rock, it had to be made perfectly level. How was this accomplished in those days? Keeping in mind also that the 14 acres upon which the Great Pyramid sits also had to be contoured to the curvature of the Earth's surface, else the blocks that would be built to the apex, which was 480 feet, would begin to slightly separate as each successive course of blocks was set in place. How did they cut down into the hard granite rock with copper tools, the only known tools of that era? And once they did manage to crack the surface, how did they possibly go about making it totally flat and smooth so that each successive core of inner core blocks would be laid without even so much as the slightest variation? In fact, along with the ball and socket features in each corner, the Great Pyramid has not moved nor settled even a fraction of an inch in over 5,000 years. The magnificent preparation for the building of the Great Pyramid is perhaps the most outstanding accomplishment of the builder, but goes virtually unnoticed as it lays in the shadow of all the other mind-boggling features.
You know, when you stop to consider so many of the design features built into the Great Pyramid, and the way it was leveled, its proximity to the center of the world's landmass. It was centered right in the center of the world's landmass. It's the most perfect compass ever. Its geometrical design in relationship to pi. Its connectivity to the stars. There's so many things that we've already mentioned that went into the design of the Great Pyramid, that to think that a mere human being at that time, 5,000 years ago, had the intelligence to design all of those features into the Great Pyramid is almost unthinkable. Now, the construction and design of the Great Pyramid had to come from at least one human that was far superior to any human of that day. And that's why we think Enoch was involved in the building and was the designer of the Great Pyramid.
And not only are the multitudinous anomalies of the Great Pyramid mind-boggling, so is the entire history of the Egyptian civilization. Traveling back into the time of that bygone era of the pharaohs requires that we first unpile 2,000 years of Christian history layered over the more than 3,000 years of Egyptian history. But sifting through 5,000 years of human history is a Herculean task, especially when many historical distortions cloud the picture. Each of these artifacts represents a different time period within Egypt's 3,000-year history. But unless you are an expert at Egyptology, you could not tell what time period corresponds to each artifact. Unless they are viewed with expert eyes, they could come from any one of three eras. The difference between these artifacts is simply not discernible to the untrained eye. So then, the study of Egypt is similar to assembling a jigsaw puzzle with numerous pieces to consider and put into place. But where to begin? That is the perplexing question. How is one to know where to place each piece? When it comes to the artifacts or the many pieces of the puzzle of a civilization, without the context, the artifacts, just like the pieces in a puzzle, have little to no meaning. What is the context for the artifacts of Egypt? The answer is time. When all the pieces are set into a time context, the purpose and meaning of the Great Pyramid becomes clear. What evidence, then, is there to support where to place the pyramid in time? This area around the Kafra Pyramid may hold a clue as to when the Great Pyramids were built. The first impression one gets is that whoever built this pyramid had to dig down to get to the bedrock before they commenced with the building of the second of the Giza pyramids. But on closer inspection of this spectacular cutback formation, we find not only erosion consistent with that of water, but also remains embedded in this sand or silt of seashells.
We're standing nearby the Kafra Pyramid, which was built after the Great Pyramid. And as we look at some of the rock around here, it becomes very obvious that this rock was not pockmarked by wind. This is water-eroded rock. And when we look up and we see some of this carved out area, it looks almost like it was mud. And then you see about halfway down a rock sticking out of this area of dirt and mud that has also been pockmarked by, it looks like water, erosion, which means that most likely these rocks, and they're all over the place, came as a result of the flood, or were pockmarked because of a lot of water. So this would date this pyramid prior to the Noahic flood that flooded this area and left water rings around the Great Pyramid that we showed you earlier. One of the often more neglected but most important considerations in determining the age of the Great Pyramid is the mortar that was discovered in between the joints of the inner core blocks. So the mortar in the joints is very interesting. And so there was a study done on the mortar because the mortar was made in such a way that it contained organic material in it, like grasses and weeds fell in it and bugs. And when they did a radiocarbon dating on the mortar, they found that the mortar was at least 400 to 500 years older than what was commonly believed was the age of the Great Pyramid. It was believed that the pyramid was built around 2400 or 2500 BC, but the mortar dated all the way back to 4000 BC at the very top of the Great Pyramid and to 3000 BC at the bottom of the Great Pyramid. So the mortar in the joints is an important aspect of the Great Pyramid's time sequence and its time context. And so the mortar tells us a great story. Remember the inventory stela? Stated on it that Khufu himself said that he was not the one that built the Great Pyramid or the Sphinx, that he only did repair work on it. Authorities today say, well, the inventory stela is forgery, that he didn't really say that. But it doesn't really make any sense when the Egyptians, pharaohs always claimed that they were responsible for stuff that they didn't build. So there's really no motivation to say that he did not do something. Most of them would say they did do something they didn't do. The inventory stela is a really important timepiece that helps us have a context for when the pyramid was really built. Because Khufu claimed that he only did repair work on the Great Pyramid, it proves that the Great Pyramid was in existence before Khufu was even born, which supports the evidence of the Great Flood and the mortar in the joints. It was discovered that one of the small pyramids on the east side of the Great Pyramid was the tomb of Khufu's mother, Hetepheres, and the inventory stela tells us that it was Khufu that built it. So then, if her tomb was built by Khufu, then how are we to understand why this master builder of the greatest man-made structure of all time would have been so negligent and careless in the design and construction of his mother's tomb, and that the other two tombs for his wives, in light of his care and consideration and careful planning of all that went into the Great Pyramid, was so radically different? Because the sophisticated architectural principles employed for the construction of the Great Pyramid were not used in Khufu's three smaller pyramids just east of the Great Pyramid. Notice at the base of the Great Pyramid how larger inner core blocks were used, then gradually smaller ones were placed on top of each succeeding layer of courses of blocks. But what is left of Hetepheres' tomb and the other two tombs to the east is something much different. They simply do not reflect the same rigor of discipline. The construction materials often start with smaller blocks at the bottom, proceed to bigger blocks, and then return to smaller. The care of construction, so noticeable in the Great Pyramid, is simply absent in the smaller pyramids to the east. These differences suggest two different builders. The builder of the Great Pyramid lived prior to Khufu, perhaps 500 to 600 years earlier, near 3100 BC, while Khufu, who built these smaller Queen's pyramids, lived later, around 2500 BC. Just as the other evidence suggests, this places the building of the Great Pyramid at a time prior to the life of Khufu. The final consideration for the puzzling time context involves the analysis of the method for how the Great Pyramid was sealed. There could have only been one way in which the pyramid could have been sealed. First, Before the ceiling of the grand gallery could have been closed, the 3 granite plugs had to be lowered and slid down the ramp all the way down into the ascending passageway to its mouth. Then, the 2 granite plugs that were to seal the passageway of the antechamber were dropped down onto the great step, which served as a platform. But each of these plugs was 4 foot wide, and the great step was only 7 foot wide, so each plug had to be dropped separately. The first plug was dropped and then slid into and through the antechamber into place, sealing the way from the antechamber into the king's chamber. With the king's chamber sealed by the first granite plug, the builders could then lower the 3 portcullis slabs from their stanchions, using ropes and wood beams as pulleys to drop the heavy portcullis slabs onto the granite floor of the antechamber. Once the men accomplished this feat, then the second granite plug was dropped onto the great step and pushed into place, completely sealing off the way from the grand gallery to the king's chamber. But with both the lower passageway and the upper passageways now sealed, the workers were trapped. How did the workers escape out of the Great Pyramid? There are those that believe they took the way of the well shaft. But the well shaft was a crude passageway that was dug from the bottom up and was not part of the original design. It was dug sometime after the Great Pyramid had been completed and not before. The only way out was through the ceiling of the Grand Gallery at the southern end before it was completely closed over. The builders used rope ladders and climbed out before the last and final ceiling joist of the Grand Gallery was set into place. Then the ceiling was closed over and sealed shut. In light of this scenario, if the pyramid was the Tomb of Khufu, the only moment his mummy could have been placed in the coffer would have been before the 2 antechamber plugs had been lowered from above, because after they had been dropped onto the great step, their width would have prevented any kind of funeral procession, and the plugs could only have been dropped before the ceiling of the Grand Gallery was closed over. Nevertheless, had he died at the halfway point in the construction of the Great Pyramid, it becomes difficult to explain how he could have built his mother and wife's tombs since he was already dead, when those pyramids could only have been built after the Great Pyramid's completion. The fact of the matter is that Khufu died later, after the Great Pyramid was completed. Much later. To be more exact, almost 600 years later. With the volume of evidence accumulating that the time frame for the building of the Great Pyramid was hundreds of years before the Pharaoh Khufu, what could have been the event that triggered and initiated its construction? This charming and colorful neighborhood lies in the back streets of West Cairo and is populated by those of the Muslim faith. And it was Muhammad around the 7th century AD who was the lightning rod that set in motion the monotheistic belief system of Islam that today rules over 1.5 billion people. Moses, on the other hand, was the anointed one who was hand-selected and chosen as the focal point which launched the monotheistic religion of Judaism when he received the 10 Commandments at Mount Sinai. And eventually he led the exodus of the Hebrews out from Egypt. And Christianity, the last to be mentioned of the 3 monotheistic religions, was ignited and empowered by Jesus Christ when he died and rose from the dead and sent the Holy Spirit on the day of Pentecost. All 3 of the world's monotheistic religions were set in motion by a special individual who stood head and shoulders above all the peoples of his time. And as a result, attached to each of these religions was a complex body of literature, customs, and traditions. But who was the individual, and what was the event that sparked and ignited the complex Egyptian religion which predominated the Nile region for over 3,000 years, and then through its extensive mythologies, dramatically influenced and affected the Grecian culture, the cradle of Western civilization. Who was he, and what took place here that literally shook the known world?
Teach me to love like one.
You know, there's many messages in the Great Pyramid. Many messages. But the Great Pyramid was principally constructed around the Kafra, the red Kafra in the King's Chamber. And all the rocks they brought in from Aswan, the granite blocks that formed the roof of the King's Chamber, and the incredible masonry was designed to maintain the integrity of the King's Kafra, the Kafra in the King's Chamber, I should say, for all of time. And the reason for that was because it was to memorialize an event that took place over 5,000 years ago. And that event was the departure of Enoch from the earth, an event so incredible to the minds of the people that day that it totally fixated them on the stars and immortality. And the whole Egyptian religion comes from that one event in that man's life, just like the other three religions, the great monotheistic religions of the world. It was that event that caused the ancient Egyptian people to be so fixated with the afterlife. Can you imagine if you knew somebody that you knew well, and one day you saw them leave, perhaps in a ship? Well, that's probably what happened with Enoch when he was taken from the earth. And the pyramid is really a monument that was prophesied by the prophet Isaiah. I will build a monument in the land of Syriad. Syriad was a king, so Syriad is the land of Cairo, and it will be a witness to the world, and it will be a witness unto the Lord of hosts. And so this great pyramid was built principally to contain that Kafra, which speaks of an endless life. So when you look at all the monotheistic religions of the world, they were all started by spiritual people, spiritual men. And Enoch was a very spiritual man of his time, and it was Enoch who was the fountainhead of the Egyptian religion. One thing that's a problem when you look back through Egyptian history is that it's very hard to pick through all the pieces and puzzles and artifacts and mummies and what have you. And when you think of a person like Enoch, it almost is impossible to wrap your mind around the guy that never died. He actually left Earth. And so he takes on kind of mythological proportions. But you wonder, if he was such a great man, wouldn't he have left something in the Egyptian culture that we could find? This is great. This is a store that we're going to look into some of the religious aspects of their Egyptian culture, because we've studied the geometry, we've studied physics, we've looked at astronomy, astrology. We've looked at so many different aspects of ancient Egyptian life, but perhaps the place to look for Enoch is in some of their mythological gods. Perhaps we can find him there. When looking backwards 5,000 years into the pre-Pharaonic era, it is a common mistake to view the ancients as pagans and their religious orientation polytheistic with many gods, especially when you examine their many and extensive mythologies. Certainly, over long periods of time, their religion did degenerate into polytheism. But originally, the Egyptian religion was monotheistic. Then, as time went by, spiritual darkness ensued, and the figures that surfaced in the wall paintings and papyrus that were merely representations of the attributes of God, whom they call Ra, unfortunately came to be individually worshipped, and the Egyptian religion sunk into polytheism. But when you visit any of the countless papyrus stores anywhere in Cairo, there is one scene that is always prevalent, and it dramatically stands out from all the others. It is known as the Final Judgment, and the central character in the scene is the strange-looking god called Toth. But why a final judgment? This is a monotheistic concept. Where did this doctrine come from? Certainly not paganism. A final judgment is associated with the accountability for how one lives out his mortal life. And in this final judgment rendering, captured on papyrus, it seems that the god Toth, the central figure in the story, is the one capable of accurately recording the facts and presiding over the judgment. But in Egyptian lore, Toth was not limited to this purpose alone. There are many more epitaphs concerning this god Toth. Toth was also known as a mediating power. He also served as a scribe of the gods, and he was credited with the invention of writing in alphabets. The ancient Egyptians regarded Toth as the master of both physical and moral law, making proper use of Mot, which was truth. He is credited with making the calculations for the establishment of the heavens, stars, earth, and everything in them. Mot was the force which maintained the universe. He is said to direct the motions of the heavenly bodies. The Egyptians believed that without his words, the gods would not exist. His power was almost unlimited in the underworld and rivaled that of Ra and Osiris. The Egyptians also credited him as the author of all works of science, religion, philosophy, chemistry, and even magic. He was known as the one that was the god of weights and measurements. This Toth was some kind of god, and the Greeks embraced him for their own and called him Hermes.
Well, we found a few representations of Toth in the store that we were just in. Actually, his ancient name was Dehuti, and to the Greeks he was known as Hermes. And there's a place about 300 kilometers south of here called Hermopolis, and evidently that's where he lived. So evidently this mythological god or some person actually lived that ended up becoming bigger than life kind of a guy, kind of the movie star of his day. And his name was Toth, Dehuti, and we're going to go up the Nile River some 180 miles to Hermopolis and see what we can find up there concerning this god Toth. Evidently some real life guy that lived long ago.
The trip to Hermopolis, former home of Toth, is a long, arduous journey over the back roads and through the small villages and towns of Middle Egypt. And while picturesque, it is still a tough 5-hour haul each way from Cairo and then back again. Our destination is off the beaten path in a very hidden and isolated area, but one which holds a key to understanding one of history's well-kept secrets. However, when you throw in an antiquated and perilous river crossing of the Nile on an old, decrepit, rusted-out ferry built somewhere near the turn of the 19th century, it's not hard to understand why few visitors, if any, take this route, and perhaps why the secret remains hidden. And while the trip did have its moments, unless you really know what you're looking for and where to find it, there's not too much to see. This neglected and ruined Grecian temple is the location of Old Hermopolis. Hermopolis was the mythological capital of the Greek god Hermes. In 350 BC, it was established by the Ptolemies as a religious shrine and place of worship for Hermes, and was built over the remnants of the ancient town Chem. The Greeks, who borrowed their mythologies from the Egyptians, believed and adopted the same attributes of the Egyptian god Toth to their own god Hermes, the most important of which was the notion that Hermes Toth was a messenger and a mediator for the gods. While the Greeks tended to anthropomorphize their gods, the Egyptians used animals to emphasize and make character statements about theirs. But no doubt Hermes was Toth. In Egyptian culture, Toth took on mythological proportions as he was identified with the ibis bird and the baboon. The ibis was a nocturnal animal, and its curved beak to the Egyptians symbolized the crescent-shaped moon. Since Toth was given as the first name of the first month of the Egyptian calendar and was also given credit as the inventor of the first Egyptian lunar calendar, he was dubbed with the title of the moon god. The impact of his renown is unknowingly retained in the Islamic religion, as the crescent moon can be seen over each and every Islamic mosque throughout the world to this day. Another nocturnal creature, the baboon, whose high-pitched shrills pierced the dawnlight, anxiously announced the arrival of a coming new day, and was also a symbolic representation of the god Toth. The idea of each new day, trumpeted by the baboons, came to represent a coming eternal, never-ending day. Thus, baboons came to represent Toth, who was the embodiment of the religious concept, and which he then authored in his book of the Eternal Day. But the title of the book was altered in the 1800s and has come to be known, unfortunately, as the Egyptian Book of the Dead. Several kilometers from these ruins, there lies a most remarkable burial site. Just beyond hundreds of these strange domed tombs, there lies beneath these barren hills a labyrinth of catacombs that make up a vast animal necropolis. Protected by armed police and rarely visited, the secret of this place continues to lie in a deep mystery. For here, once buried in this ancient cemetery, were multitudes of mummified animals. As a tribute, thousands and thousands of mummified ibis and baboons, emblematic of the god Toth, tells an incredible story as to the extent of religious devotion rendered unto the god Toth by the multitudes. These massive expressions of religious superstition, however, were radically resisted and contradicted by the pharaoh Akhenaten in 1350 BC, who sought to reestablish a monotheistic faith in Egypt. The fact that his home base, Amarna, is right next to Hermopolis is no strange coincidence, and most likely it was the truth about Toth, not the myths and legends, that impacted Akhenaten and motivated him to restore Egypt to monotheism. But peering into ancient mythologies is similar to looking into the heavens through an antiquated telescope. Consequently, we are left with the distorted lens of mythologies to peer through as we attempt to look back into the far reaches of the ancient past. In countless epitaphs, well beyond any other mythological god in Egypt, Toth was actually defined in great detail, and the vast number of epitaphs which have been handed down through time suggest that this god was well known, highly esteemed, honored, and even loved. But as we study and calculate the accumulating facts drawn from the deep well of history, the distortion from the imperfect lens of mythology begins to disappear. And it is because of the hundreds of epitaphs which provide insight into his personality and character and the location of his home residence, we can see that Toth was not only known, but more importantly, he was an actual living, breathing human being. The facts of history tell us he was of a tremendous intelligence, highly ethical, and beyond reproach, and why we see him here in this rendering of the Last Judgment, a metaphor expressing his brilliant character, and that's just to mention a few of his many attributes. Of course, one of his most stunning and enduring accomplishments was the invention of the lunar calendar. Toth was most certainly not the average human being of that day, perhaps of any day. And as time passed, he was idolized, then deified, and finally immortalized and worshipped as a god. But it was here in the Grand Gallery, the magnificent astral observatory and the location for the invention of the Egyptian lunar calendar, where we make a decisive discovery. At the entrance to the Great Pyramid, we find that the multi-ton door was hung on 2 pins and could only be opened from the inside. It was marvelously camouflaged so that it could not be detected by the casual onlooker, but perfectly set so that it looked very much like the casing stones butted up to it on each adjoining side. Since it could only be opened from the inside, this meant that people or priests actually had to be residing or living inside. In order for this small group of men to have a place to reside while they went about their work, living quarters were designed into the Great Pyramid that served as a temporary dwelling place. And although it has come to be known as the Queen's Chamber, it was the residence for an esoteric priesthood. The shafts that were built into the walls supplied air into the interior. The shafts were not essentially used to point to the stars as the shafts in the King's Chamber were, but had a utilitarian use until the men left. When the pyramid reached where the ceiling was closed over, there was no need for air any longer, because the priests had gone and the shafts were closed over and sealed. And this is the reason why the shafts do not protrude all the way through to the outside as do the shafts in the King's Chamber, which had a far different purpose. The priests, living in close proximity to the Grand Gallery, had easy access. The Grand Gallery was not principally designed as a holding facility for granite plugs, nor was it finely crafted as an artistic expression to trumpet the way to the King's Chamber. It had a far more scientific and sophisticated purpose. During the nights, the priests would study and track the movement of the moon and the stars in their astral observatory. It was from these observations that the priests learned how to track the movements of the moon from solstice to solstice, and certainly the emerging priesthood was presided over by Toth. The Book of Enoch was a widely read treatise during the 1st century and was often the source of many of the teachings of Jesus, lending, of course, great credibility to its authenticity. What is very curious about this ancient book is that it contains numerous pages of advanced astronomical calculations of the movements of the moon, and then a description of a lunar calendar, which derived its invention from those calculations. So not only was the Egyptian god Toth given credit for the lunar calendar, so was the biblical character Enoch. So who should get the credit for the invention of the lunar calendar, Toth or Enoch? On careful inspection of these 2 men, we find other similarities that are so striking there can only be one conclusion. Toth was a righteous judge and presided over judgments. Enoch was a righteous man and was taken. Toth, according to legend, was known as a liaison of the gods. Enoch, according to Genesis, walked with the Elohim, or the gods. Toth was the Egyptian god of wisdom, justice, writing, measurements, master of the stars, and considered the right hand of Ra, or God, as he was called in Egypt. Enoch, we know, prophesied of the future and had connectivity to the wisdom of God that far surpassed any mortal of that time or of time to come, and served as a prophet or voice of God at that time on earth. These 2 personages, Toth and Enoch, merge over the lunar calendar into one entity, and we find them here, one and the same person. Enoch came to be known in the Egyptian world as Toth, the moon god, inventor of the Egyptian lunar calendar. But Toth was nonetheless Enoch, the biblical character known as the calendar man. The great and brilliant man Enoch, who escaped death and was taken, became deified as Toth, and the mythologies that followed were merely distorted renderings of his actual physical presence on the earth. There was a time when messengers from other realms of our Milky Way galaxy were permitted direct access to our planet. In the Egyptian histories, it was chronicled as the Age of Osiris, called the Time of the Gods. The tributaries of many myths and legends derive their beginning from this headwater era in history. That Enoch was a recipient of the brilliant starlight intelligence of those messengers allowed him to grasp enormous volumes of information and wisdoms of mathematics, geometry, astronomy, writing, atomic structure, chemistry, and weights and measures. The most incredible proof of his knowledge is encrypted in the mysterious boss located in the antechamber of the Great Pyramid, and it is this esoteric information that conclusively proves that Enoch was the builder of the Great Pyramid. Sir Isaac Newton's fascination with the Great Pyramid led him to intensive studies where he discovered that the polar diameter of the Earth was 500 million inches in length. Of course, Newton only understood what would remain this universal length and measurement of the inch by looking from the outside in. But Enoch knew this measurement from divine revelation and embossed it on a granite leaf in the antechamber. There he placed the mysterious boss, which was the seal of his handiwork, and had it carved out of granite 25 inches from the east wall. We know that the base sides of the Great Pyramid are set at 365 sacred cubits, or 9,135 inches. But how was this 25-inch measurement, which equaled what was called the sacred cubit, determined? The Earth, as it spins on its axis, also has a wobble. This wobble effect is a phenomena of forces exerted by the sun causing bulges at the Earth's equator. The wobble effect is best explained in terms of a spinning top. As a top begins to lose momentum, it begins to wobble. It is the same kind of circular movement or wobble of the Earth which, moving at a constant speed over long periods of time, alters the direction of the polar axis. One revolution is completed every 25,920 years. Accordingly, from the Earth point of view, this creates the precession of the equinox, which is the revolving movement of the Earth through the 12 constellations of the zodiac. One cycle through the zodiac corresponds with one rotation of the Earth's wobble and has been noted takes 25,920 years. When the pyramid is laid on its side, the two diagonals drawn from top left to bottom right, then top right to bottom left, when measured in pyramid inches, each line equals 1/2 the number of years that it takes for the Earth to complete one wobble or pass through each house of the zodiac. That is, each diagonal line is exactly 12,960 pyramid inches, which equates to 12,960 years, each pyramid inch equaling 1 year. What this means was that Enoch used the length of years of the precession of the equinox cut into two diagonal lines to determine the base of the Great Pyramid. Each diagonal in turn would govern and determine the lines that would be drawn to form the base. The base of the pyramid was set then by the diagonals, and those diagonals determined that for there to be 365 equal integers, the sacred cubit thus could only be 25 inches. It took 365 25 inches to form each base, the number of days in a year, and the number of years Enoch lived on the earth. Once the sacred cubit was determined by its relationship with the precession of the equinox, Enoch left his encoded seal in the antechamber, waiting for its secret to be decoded. And then, when it was all said and done, they took him. Can there be any more conclusive proof that the supernatural knowledge that was utilized and ensconced and encrypted into the Great Pyramid came from sources, angelic sources, outside the realms of knowledge of the earth, and that Enoch was the focal point for imparting that knowledge?
We're looking at the
the 3 pyramids on the Giza Plateau that are actually, they're not in perfect alignment, but they are in perfect alignment with the stars in the belt of Orion. And this whole area was built, and it was discovered by Robert Bauval 15 years ago or so, that these pyramids actually were a reflection of the stars in the belt of Orion. So on Earth, even though they're physical, they are representations of stars. The pyramids were actually intended to represent stars. And because it's a very mystical and mysterious reason for that, but they actually represent us. We are the fallen stars, and the pyramids are actually representations of humans. And the whole reason for them is to help us come to grips with who we are, why we're caught up in this condition on this planet, what we're supposed to be doing while we're here, and then where we're going. So there's so many messages in the pyramids that need to be expressed and told. And just sitting here this evening when the sun's going down and looking at this site, that's is an incredible experience.